You've probably received the old lecture from your parents: if your friends jumped off a cliff, would you? And thought, of course I wouldn't. Well, what if your friends started dancing and couldn't stop for days, or rioted because they thought their genitals were being stolen? What if they couldn't stop laughing? Would you follow? Your answer is probably still a resounding no, but sometimes we as humans don't always act as rationally as we'd like to think. Today we're going to be looking at instances of mass psychogenic illness, or MPI, more commonly known as mass hysteria. Before we jump in, let's define it. In sociology and psychology, mass hysteria is thought of as a phenomenon that transmits collective illusions of threats, whether real or imaginary, through a population and society as a result of rumours and fear. In medicine, the term is used to describe the spontaneous manifestation or production of chemicals in the body of the same or similar hysterical physical symptoms by more than one person. The most common form of MPI, or mass hysteria, occurs when a group of people believe that they are suffering from a similar disease or ailment. It happens all over the world and occurs more often than you'd think. The first case we're going to jump into is the dancing plagues. Now, you've probably heard of the one that occurred in 1518, but there are many more you haven't heard of, occurring in the year 1000, the 12th century, the 13th century and the 14th century. The outbreak of the dancing plague in July 1518 started with a single woman who started dancing in the streets of Strasbourg. After a single week of non-stop dancing, this woman had 34 people dancing with her in the streets. Within a month, the number of dancers were estimated to be anywhere between 50 to 400, depending on the sources. It's reported people continued to dance as others in their groups died of heart attacks, strokes, and sheer exhaustion. It's important to note, the story of the dancing plague has many conflicting views of what really happened. Some will say the people died, while others will argue they didn't. What everyone agrees on is the people dancing did so involuntarily, as they writhed in pain, screamed for someone to help them, and begged for mercy. Some experts believe the cause lies in mold, called ergot, that grows on the stalks of damp rye. When consumed unknowingly in bread, the mold can trigger a violent convulsion and delusions. As rye is used to make bread, it could be likely that the town supply did contain this mold and was consumed by the masses. Historian John Wooler, author of A Time to Dance, A Time to Die, disputes this theory, saying, "These people were not just trembling, shaking or convulsing, although they were entranced. Their arms and legs were moving as if they were purposefully dancing." Wooler also argued that the symptoms caused by the mold did not cause coordinated movements that lasted for days. Instead, Wooler proposes a more interesting theory, referencing the hard times these people faced before the dancing began. The masses of 1518 had suffered famine caused by bitter winters, hot summers, and hailstorms. Many died due to malnutrition, and those who survived were forced to slaughter their farm animals and beg on the street to do so. If all of that wasn't enough to deal with, smallpox, syphilis, and leprosy were sweeping through the area. What Wooler argues is that intense anxiety, fear, and a Christian church legend involving Saint Vitus were the cause. The apparent Christian legend warned not to provoke Saint Vitus, for he would send down plagues of compulsive dancing. This legend could have started in the German town of Kolbig on Christmas Eve in 1021, where it's argued the dancing plague first took place. It is said on this day, a crowd of 18 people gathered outside a church and began to dance. The priest inside the church was unable to perform mass because of the noise and ordered them to stop. They ignored him, continued to hold hands, dance, clap, and chant in unison. Our source, a local chronicler, says this priest cursed them to dance for an entire year as punishment for their ring dance of sin. This was said to have worked, and the group were unable to control their limbs, dancing for another year. Afterwards, they slept from the exhaustion, and many did not wake up. Now, I'm sure you believe this not to be true, and I'd agree with you, but there are other sources that say while this chronicler did exaggerate the incident of 1021, the dancing plague did actually occur. Again in 1247, the German town of Erfurt succumbed to the plague. It is said over 200 people danced on a bridge over the Moselle River in Maastricht until it collapsed, drowning them all. More medieval chroniclers write about this plague almost 150 years later, in 1374, reporting that the dancing plague swept across Germany, the Low Countries, and northeastern France. Sources from these times agree, recalling an amazing epidemic where thousands of people danced in agony for days or weeks, screaming of terrible visions and imploring priests and monks to save their souls. The events prior to the dancing of 1518 and the incredible levels of stress people of the Middle Ages faced, coupled with the strong belief of superstitions such as this legend, is what Waller believes caused the events of 1518 to take place. Now, while I was researching the dancing epidemic, I came across Coro, or Coro. Now, Coro itself is defined as a culture-bound syndrome, delusional disorder in which an individual has an overpowering belief that his or her sex organs are retracting and will disappear despite lacking any true changes to their genitals. Now, if that sounded weird, it is. Coro is borrowed from the Malay language and means the head of a turtle, in reference to how it looks when they retract their heads into their shells. In the Western Hemisphere, we do have a name for this syndrome, and we call it genital retraction syndrome. This syndrome occurs in all parts of the world, and mass hysteria has been induced in Africa, Asia, and Europe. However, psychological components of Coro anxiety include fear of impending death, penile dissolution, and loss of sexual power. Feelings of impending death, along with retraction and perceived involuntary ejaculation, seems to occur due to cultural beliefs of Coro symptoms. There are sporadic cases of Coro occurring in Nepal, Sudan, Jordan, Nigeria, France, Britain, the United States, and Canada. However, while genital shrinkage is reported in the Western Hemisphere, the symptoms of Coro are not felt. The incomplete forms of Coro are regarded as the non-cultural forms, while the complete form, with acute anxiety, is the classical, culture-bound type. In China, there are several records indicating genital retraction, mass hysteria starting in the Hainan Island and the Leizhou Peninsula in Guangdong, China during the 19th century. Outbreaks continued to occur and were recorded in 1948, 1955, 1966, and 1974. These outbreaks would occur whenever there was social tension or impending disaster. The last widespread episode occurred during 1984 through to 1985, lasting over a year with 3,000 people in 16 different cities and provinces. After this time, a mental health campaign was run, and with the improvement in the local economies resulting in a better quality of life, the condition faded. Coro also struck Singapore in October 1967 for 10 days. Newspapers reported some had developed Coro after eating pork inoculated with the swine flu vaccine. 97 cases of Coro were reported in a single hospital within a day of the news report, and after 5 days the government would make public announcements on television and in the newspapers. In Thailand, in November 1976, at least 350 cases were reported by mostly Thai males, causing the media to blame Vietnamese food and tobacco poisoning for causing these occurrences. More Coro cases would be found in South India during August and September 2010 among the migrant labour population of North India. Reportedly, the epidemic spread to about 100 individuals in 3 labour camps within 2 weeks. In Western Nigeria, during the late 70s and early 80s, newspapers reported cases of genital shrinking. However, the difference in culture would change the impact of Coro on the afflicted. Rather than the focus on genital shrinkage, they centered on retraction and did not have the fear of death their Southeast Asian counterparts suffered from. Many afflicted believed Coro to be associated with theft using witchcraft or juju, and Coro would spread from Nigeria to Cameroon, Ghana, the Ivory Coast, Sudan, and the Congo. There were even cases of mob attacks on individuals people believed were responsible. Forms of this hysteria were also found in Europe during the Middle Ages, but they were a little bit more strange, which sounds weird saying. Men believed they could lose their genitals through attacks by witches. They believed they would reappear once the witches responsible had been appeased. During this time, the witches were said to store the stolen genitals in birds' nests or in boxes, where they believed, and this is the weirdest part, they moved themselves like living members and ate oats and corn. There were at least 3 other publications from the US, Russia, and England in the 1880s that would report genital retraction pathology, but did not use the Malay or Chinese term. Moving on from genitals, a sentence I didn't think I'd ever say, we have the Tanganyika laughter epidemic. The laughing epidemic occurred on January 30th, 1962 at a mission-run boarding school in Kinshasa. It started with 3 girls who began laughing and spread through the school, affecting 95 out of 159 pupils, all aged from 12 to 18. Symptoms were said to have lasted from a few hours to up to 16 days. These laughing fits were said to have been accompanied by fainting, flatulence, respiratory problems, rashes, crying, and screaming. This would become such an issue, with students unable to concentrate on their work, that the school would close down on March 18th. The laughter spread to a nearby village, where mostly young people would begin to have laughing fits. In April and May of the same year, 217, mostly young villagers, would suffer from laughing fits. The school would reopen on May 21st, but close again by the end of June, and spread to an all-girls middle school, affecting 48 girls. 18 months after it started, it finally died off, and by the end, 14 schools had been shut down, and 1,000 people had been affected. Many began to theorize its causation. A student by the name of Joe Bradshaw had this to say about the incident. There's rumours it was carbon dioxide from the photography room. We heard it was lead paint. Nobody knows. Christian Hempelman, then of Purdue University, believed the laughter was stress-induced. In 1962, the country had just won its independence. He said the students had reported feeling stressed because of higher expectations by teachers and parents. Christian would go on to say that MPI, or mass hysteria, usually occurs in people without a lot of power. MPI is a last resort for people of low status. It's an easy way for them to express that something is wrong. Sociologist Robert Bartholomew and psychiatrist Simon Wesley believed it a culture-specific epidemic hysteria, pointing out the occurrences in 1960s Africa were prevalent in missionary schools, and Tanganyikan society was ruled by strict traditional elders, so the likelihood is the hysteria was a manifestation of the cultural dissonance between the traditional conservatism at home and the new ideas challenging those beliefs in school, which they termed conversion reactions. Dr. Jim Bolton, consultant psychiatrist at St. Helier Hospital in Surrey, said, "There's a strong possibility that it is a case of mass hysteria. It tends to occur in close communities, particularly schools, sometimes sports teams and convents. It occurs across all kinds of cultures. It is very common, particularly at a time of stress. I remember when I was at school, there would be fainting epidemics. Girls for weeks would be fainting left, right and center. Generally, what happens is one person experiences symptoms and then someone else with whom they're in close proximity experiences them too, and then it just mushrooms." From the 3 cases we've covered, the underlying similarities, regardless of the difference in culture, is stress, anxiety and fear. It's easy to look at these cases and believe we would never fall into mass hysteria of this magnitude. But these events are a shocking display of how erratic and powerful the subconscious mind can be.